fleeing the Berlin Wall. My grandmother, Avisa Japesky, fled Ukraine during the Russian Revolution. They came here to America for the promise of freedom, and so it really is of great interest to me. And the question of what freedom really means is something that's rolled around in my head for many years. And I take a look at freedom, and I see that it kind of, for me, it all culminates in property rights and the ability to own property. When the Russians came into Kleinleben, Germany, and they took over in East Germany, they took away the property that my parents owned, their family farm, and the restaurant bar that they had, and they had a little apartment complex that they managed and owned, and that was all taken away from them during that time, and it was almost 40 years of a nightmare kind of a situation for them. Here, my father was just a one-man business, a little landscaping business, and he was always thought of himself as just an average Joe in a very exceptional country. And you wonder where the freedom really comes from. We got a great constitution that protects freedoms, for example, the freedom of speech. And for me, the freedom of speech comes very simply from a higher power, the higher power that gave me vocal cords. I have the ability to say anything I want. Only government can restrict what I say, and only the Constitution can protect us from improper government. So I'm really pleased with the idea that you're all talking about freedom in America, freedom in Michigan, and I hope you really take a look at what that truly means.
I'm pleased to invite John Lott from the Crime Prevention Research Center to talk about law and economics and some examples.
Well, I want to thank you all for inviting me here virtually to come and speak. I'm an economist, and I've been asked to speak about law and economics. And since I know some of the students there have used one of my books in their classes, I thought I would use some examples and kind of flesh out some of the discussion from that. So I suppose, first of all, before we get into what law and economics, we have to talk a little bit about what economics is. And economics is based on a fairly simple idea. It's just the notion that if something's more costly, people will do less of it. The greater the return, they'll do more of it. And that one simple idea can explain so much of the world, and all the examples that I'm going to go through fit into that notion. So what's law and economics? Well, it's taking that simple idea that really, another way of phrasing is that demand curves slope downward. It's called the law of demand, and applying it to areas such as antitrust, to fraud, to regulations, to licensing, to crime. So just a little bit of my background. I've been an academic most of my life. I've taught at University of Pennsylvania, at the Wharton School, University of Chicago. I've been at Yale, Stanford, Rice University. But I was also chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission in Washington. And you say, well, what would an economist be doing at a commission that would set penalties for criminals? And the notion is fairly simple, and that is, should the penalty be based on the harm from the crime? And how do you measure what the harm from the crime is? And should it be related to the probability that you're going to be able to catch somebody and punish them? And so we'll go through a little bit of a discussion on that in a minute. But let me give you a basic notion from that, and that is, what should a penalty be for a crime? So how should the penalties be related, the size of the penalties be related to crime? Take something like speeding, for example. Would we want to have the death penalty if somebody goes 5 miles an hour over the speed limit? What's the harm, for example, from speeding? Well, it seems like one aspect of the harm, maybe the aspect of the problem from speeding, is that if you go and you speed, it increases the probability of an accident, probability that you're going to go and harm other people. And so now you want to go and figure out what the penalty should be from that. And what we do is we basically break that down into two parts. But it's to make sure that the penalty is equal to the expected harm from the crime. So there's some harm that you're going to commit and some probability that you're going to go and catch the person and be able to punish them. So if you can catch them with certainty, then you're going to have a smaller penalty than if you only catch them 1 out of every 100 times that they're going to go and commit a crime. And the reason why we don't want to have a penalty that's larger than the expected harm, such as the death penalty for somebody going and speeding, there are multiple reasons. But one reason is that there may be benefits for people speeding sometime. Maybe you have an ill child or relative that you want to try to go and get to the hospital. Or maybe there's some big business deal that you're trying to do that could be creating millions of dollars worth of wealth. And so, we, in some sense, leave it up to the individuals to decide, is the harm that I'm going to be doing to others, is that balanced off? How is that balanced off by maybe getting this sick relative to the hospital fast enough? We don't want to make people so afraid that they would never think of going a little bit over the speed limit. So that's kind of how you balance it all. Now, and it's similar to anything else. If you were going to have supply and demand curves, we want to have it so people will buy an additional unit of a good as long as they value it more than the cost. And so in this case, the cost would be the harm from people speeding too much. So let me give you a simple example. When I was at the Sentencing Commission, one of the examples that came up was the Exxon Valdez ran aground and had a big oil spill. And the Sentencing Commission was deeply involved in trying to determine what the criminal penalty should be for environmental crimes, such as oil spills. And one thing, if you looked at past practice, what actually happened when judges and juries were making decisions in the past, you would find that a big spill, such as an Exxon Valdez, the penalty would pretty much be equal to the harm from the crime. Whereas if you had somebody who was caught throwing a couple gallons of oil into a waterway someplace, the penalty could be hundreds of times greater than the harm from the crime. A lot of people at the Sentencing Commission say, it doesn't make any sense. You should, if the crime is big, that's where we should have a really big penalty relative to the harm. And if it's a small one, maybe it should just be equal to the harm from the crime. Now, if I was actually in a room where I'd be able to talk to people, I would ask, why is that right now? Why would you want to have it the way the judges had previously done it? Were they just wrong? Did they not realize that we should have really large penalties relative to the harm for big crimes and not so much for small crimes, so they just got it backwards? It's possible. But I think there's actually a fairly simple explanation for it, and it's based on the discussion that we just had with regard to speeding cars. And that is, if you have an oil spill from the Exxon Valdez, what's the likelihood that you're going to catch the person or the company that did the spill? I mean, it's not like they're going to say, that's not our boat. I mean, you got the boat stranded there. There's Exxon Valdez on the side. You're going to know whose boat it is and who's responsible for the spill. So the probability of catching them is 100%. Whereas if somebody goes and surreptitiously drops a couple gallons of oil off the side of their boat, chances of finding them are really pretty remote. It's very unlikely you're going to catch them. And so if you want to make, think of what the expected penalty is going to be for them, you're going to have to take into account that there's maybe 1 out of 200 chance or 1 out of 500 chance that you're going to catch them, whereas in the large one, it's a 1 in 1 chance. And one could argue that's essentially what judges have been doing for decades prior to the Sentencing Commission. The Sentencing Commission reversed that, though. And one could argue that to our detriment that they did that, because now the low probability crimes in terms of being caught, the small ones, are maybe being punished too little, and the big ones are being punished way, way too much. Let me give you another example that's related to all this, and that is one thing you saw if you looked at past practice on different types of crimes is that for environmental crimes, the penalty would be, let's say, $3 per dollar lost from the crime on average. Whereas if you look at something like fraud, it would be 18 cents per dollar lost from the crime. And again, a lot of the commissioners at the Sentencing Commission say, oh, that's not right. You know, the penalty, there's no way the penalty should be 18 cents per dollar lost from the crime. It should be at least that and much more. And so one of the things that they did was they dramatically increased the penalties for fraud from 18 cents per dollar lost to about the same as it was for environmental, about $3 per dollar lost from the crime. Now the question is, again, was there a reason for why judges had relatively low penalties before? Or was it just, you know, they didn't mind people going committing fraud? And I would argue again that there's something that the current discussion has missed, and that is there are multiple types of penalties that people face. One important penalty for companies that go and commit fraud is their reputation. So if Bayer Aspirin were to sell sugar tablets in place of real aspirin that's there, people wouldn't be willing to pay as much for Bayer Aspirin as they did before. If you go to CVS or some other type of pharmacy and you look at the different aspirin, there's some aspirin that costs a lot more, kind of the brand name ones. But something like let's say a Joe Green's aspirin is going to be relatively cheap. You're paying for quality assurance. But if people don't believe that they have a good chance of actually getting the higher quality aspirin that's gone through different types of potency tests and purity tests and things like that, they're not going to be willing to pay as much. And if you go and you cheat them, they're not going to be willing to pay you the higher price. And that reduction in price that you're going to be able to go and sell each bottle of aspirin for is a cost then. In fact, it's very large. And research out there has found that the criminal penalties for fraud, they only represent about 5% or so of the total penalty that firms suffer when they go and commit fraud. The big loss, as soon as it's announced that they're being charged with fraud, is huge drops in stock prices, which are much, much, much larger than any criminal penalties that they're going to end up facing. So just some ideas of, in terms of crime, how law and economics maybe can help explain that maybe in the past people weren't quite as dumb as one might think. Let me give you another example and something completely different. You often hear that when you buy a new car, as soon as you drive it off the market, it's going to lose a lot of its value. There's some people who throw out numbers claiming that maybe you have a 25% drop in the price of cars. And it's called what's called a lemons problem. And the notion is that, well, the only types of people who are going to try to quickly sell their cars after they buy them are people who find that there's something seriously wrong with the car. And, maybe cars that are sold a couple years later, people who have serious problems, along with people who just want to get a new car. And so it's not as likely that it's just lemon problem cars, but the ones that are sold early, the claim are the ones that are going to be fundamentally flawed in some way. So you buy a car for $20,000, and as soon as you take it off the lot, if you're going to try to sell it again, the claim would be you could only get $15,000 for it. But think about this for a minute, okay? If that was true, what would that imply? It would imply that there's no way for less than $5,000 you could go and convince somebody whether or not you really had a, quote, lemon or not, right? And So the question is, for, let's say, $4,000, could the person who's buying the car find a mechanic that he trusts to go and certify that the car really isn't a lemon, something that just is, fundamentally broken down in some way and it can't be easily fixed? Because if he could find a mechanic that he could pay $4,000 to, and obviously $4,000 is probably a lot more than he would have to pay, but let's say $4,000. Well, there's no reason then why the car would fall from $20,000 to $15,000. It could fall from $20,000 to $16,000, right? Because the cars that were in good shape, he could find out for less than $5,000 whether or not it was really a car that was in good shape or not. Well, if it's costs $3,000 to go and hire a mechanic, then the most it can fall down to $17,000. If it's $1,000, the most it's going to fall down is to $19,000. But the thing is, there are other factors at work here. Car companies have transferable warranties. You go and you buy a car, you may get 36,000 miles or 3 years. There's some that have even longer warranties that are going to be on the car. So if there's a problem with the car, the person's going to be able to go and get it repaired. So it raises real questions about whether we should even expect the car to fall that much in price, if at all. So let me give you another example here. You have auto theft is pretty important. We have, about $4 or $5 billion worth of cars supposedly stolen each year. And so some people have argued that we should go and have low-jack devices. These are little radio signal devices that you can put on a car, and if a car gets stolen, the police can press a button, and a unique radio signal is going to be coming out from that car, and then the police can triangulate on it and go and get the car back. But there's an interesting problem. There's some academics who claim that, boy, you put low-jack devices on cars, it'll reduce auto theft by 25%. That's a huge amount. But the thing they point out is that while these stupid insurance companies, they don't give discounts unless they're forced to do so for cars that put low-jack on. So states that mandate that you have to give a $1,000 reduction in insurance, or let's say a 10% reduction, that's the most they give. If a state says you have to give a 5% reduction, that's the most they give. They only give what they're mandated to do. If it's a 2% reduction, that's the most reduction that they'll give in insurance premiums. Well, is it just that the car companies or the insurance companies are stupid? I would argue it would seem like a lot of people must be missing out on this great opportunity. One of the claims that are made, well, there's what they call a free riding problem in economics, that you go and put low-jack devices on your car if your insurance company is going to go and benefit all the other insurance companies because an individual owner, or auto theft thief, isn't going to know whether the particular car he's trying to steal or not is going to have low-jack devices on it. So it reduces auto theft everywhere. Well, that's true. Though I'll explain why there may be some problems with that in a second. But you still get some benefit from getting your car back if this works, right? And so maybe it won't be the full value that you get reduction in auto theft, but if the insurance company gets the car back and it's in one piece, then you'd imagine there would at least be some reduction in the insurance premium, and they don't do that. So why? Well, let me give you one example with regard to this externality problem that's there. And that is externalities are saying that others benefit from your expenditures and you can't capture that benefit that they get. Let's say that's true for an insurance company. How could you solve it? Let's say you're president of North American Porsche. All right? Well, it seems to me that there's a simple solution here, and that is you just put low-jack devices on all the Porsches that you sell. And so an auto thief goes into a garage, there's a BMW and a Porsche right next to each other. Well, if low-jack devices are on all the cars and this little hidden radio tracking device is hidden someplace on the Porsche and you can't figure it out, then it seems like he'd go and steal the BMW. Porsche would save its cars from being stolen. People would be willing to pay more for their cars. Insurance premiums would be lower on those types of cars, which would be one of the reasons why people would be willing to pay more for them. And it would capture the entire benefit from having the low jack devices on. But yet, Porsche, BMW, Cadillac, nobody puts these little low jack devices on their cars. Cadillac has OnStar, and we can talk about that. But the thing is, nobody does this. And one of the options is, well, maybe this doesn't work as well as people think it does. And in fact, if you actually were to call up the insurance companies, they'll tell you, sure, we get the car back after a week, but it's basically already stripped. Or they've moved it out of the area so quickly that we can't find it after it's been moved out, because there's like a limit on how far these radio signals can go. Or they put them in something called a Faraday cage, which the high-end auto thieves can put it in there, which basically blocks the radio signal, so you can't trace it there either. So in any case, they spend the money, and it doesn't seem to work very well. And there are lots of other examples I could go and give you. Everything from why judges aren't as smart now as they used to be, to things about abortion and crime that we could talk about. One of my favorites is how professional licensing is set up. I would argue that almost all the professional licensing rules that you can set up have one characteristic that actually lowers the quality of people who go into a profession. If you want to go and get a PhD, there's some people who get PhDs in 2 years, and there's some people who go and get PhDs in 6 years. We don't have a limit on how long you can go through. But if you want to become a lawyer, law schools are required to make people take at least 2.5 years of classes, or the law school is going to lose its accreditation. Why not let somebody get it done in 1.5 years if they can do that, or somebody else take 4 years? The problem is that when you put this restriction, the very smartest people who would have gotten through, let's say, in 1.5 years in law school, by making them have to take 2.5 years, they're the ones, the smartest ones, who presumably would make more money in other areas. They're the ones who you're making it more costly for them to go and get through law school. And so you're discouraging the very smartest people. If you just wanted to reduce the number of people going into law school, you could just reduce the pass rate on the tests that are there. But they don't do that. They can make it more difficult in the tests and lower the percentage that pass, but they don't do that. And so there's lots of other issues we could talk about. We could talk about the impact of secret ballots on people voting. Did you know that we didn't have secret ballots really until 100 years ago in the United States? Last state to do it was in the 1940s. And that actually there's a lot of evidence that indicates that when we started to have secret ballots, the participation rate fell by about 10%. 10% fewer people voted than they did before they had the secret ballots. And there's a simple reason for that. And that is, when it was an open ballot, when people knew how you were voting, people could bribe you in how you voted. And when people weren't getting paid to vote anymore in a particular way, and they couldn't prove to them how they were voting, the voting participation rate went down. Now we have mail-in ballots, and one could argue you have more bribing that goes on because you can fill out your ballot in front of them and you can send it in, or they can send it in for you, and they will know then how you're going to vote. But anyway, it's really interesting to see how state after state, when it would adopt secret ballots as opposed to open ballots, how you'd see drops in voter participation. So it's the simple notion that if something becomes more costly, people do less of it, or as you get a greater return, you do more of it, whether it's secret ballots or who goes and becomes a licensed professional, because every licensed profession basically has some time requirement that you have to spend, not just taking the test. All those stories that we just went through are just based on the simple notion of what we defined economics to be to begin with. And so I hope you've enjoyed this, and I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Up next, we have Ed Haislmaier, and he's going over the Heritage Foundation, and his topic is healthcare.
Well, thank you, everyone, for inviting me to talk to you today about the problems with Obamacare. This is, of course, a topic with a great deal of material. It is a very large piece of legislation and a lot of various views. But what I'd like to do is focus on what I see as some of the core flaws or design problems in this legislation, because I think that helps us understand two things. One, what went wrong, and the second is how to fix it. There, as I see it, really 5 significant ones, and then there's some others as well that are of lesser significance. Let me start with the first of those, and that is the way they designed the eligibility for the subsidies. The idea of the authors of Obamacare was that they were going to expand health insurance coverage to people who are uninsured. They expanded Medicaid to a portion of the population, and in fact what we have seen over the past year and a half is that the vast majority of the increase in the number of Americans with insurance has occurred among those people gaining Medicaid coverage. The other thing that they did was to provide a system of subsidies for buying health insurance to people who didn't have it. Now, this was where their first mistake came in. Rather than providing a uniform structure of assistance, what they did was to target the subsidies to people in a certain income range, those between the poverty level and 4 times the poverty level. And then they made those subsidies quite generous, which had the effect of setting up an incentive for people who already had insurance but were not getting as generous a subsidy. I mean, they were buying it tax-free, say, from their employer, but it was nowhere near as generous a subsidy as what was being offered in Obamacare. Created an incentive for those individuals to migrate to the new, more generous subsidies. Of course, that would have made the bill prohibitively expensive. So what they then did was to try to limit the availability of the subsidies by saying, well, if you have access to employer coverage, you can't get the new subsidies. And that created a whole new set of problems. That meant that they had to figure out who had access to employer coverage, and they had to have a way of screening those people out, and they had to have a way of forcing employers to continue offering coverage. And so that inevitably led to adding an employer mandate, because that was the only to provide coverage, because that's the only way to do it. It also meant that you had to create in this arrangement some way of screening people for eligibility. And that's what the exchanges were designed to do. If you think about it, if you simply said to everyone, like we would with other tax provisions, well, here's, the money, we'll give you a tax break of X for buying health insurance, people could have just gone out and done it on their own. They wouldn't have needed any kind of eligibility screening if it applied to everybody else, and you wouldn't, if you applied the tax break uniformly across the population, and therefore you wouldn't have needed this kind of administrative mechanism, the exchanges. So essentially, out of this problem of trying to provide very significant subsidies, but then only to a relatively smaller group of people, and then telling everybody else, well, you can't get it, they created problems that could only be rectified by creating these exchanges to administer it, and by creating an employer mandate to try to enforce most employers to do something that was against their interest and against the interest of their employees, which is to continue providing coverage on a less subsidized basis. That leads us to the second big problem with this, and that is the subsidies themselves were a very complicated design. One of the things that I think people really don't fully appreciate about this law is the extent to which it is less about health care and more about income and welfare. And by that I mean you could, as I said, have provided some sort of tax credit, some sort of subsidy on a broad basis to everyone. But when you start micromanaging the size of that or the amount of it by income, you enter a whole new level of complexity. And so they linked these subsidies and varied these subsidies based on the income of the people who were qualifying for them. And that's after you exclude the people who have access to coverage elsewhere, who you told, well, you can't get the subsidies. So what they did was they used something called the federal poverty level. Now, this was a particularly bad idea because the federal poverty level really doesn't relate to health insurance. It was a measure, and it's an imperfect measure, but it was a measure designed to figure out sort of what subsistence level was for feeding a family or an individual. So when you have two people in the family, you're not buying, your costs don't necessarily go up in a straight linear fashion, twice as much, 3 times as much for 3, etc. But that's not how health insurance works. And then they put this through the tax code. So they created a tax credit for the subsidy. In other words, the subsidy would be paid out through the tax code. And that was a huge problem because the tax code simply isn't designed to work with this very granular approach to allocating different subsidy levels based on percent of poverty. Think about it, the tax code simply says, well, what's your filing status? Are you single? Are you a head of household, meaning an adult with 1 or more dependents? Or are you married, meaning 2 adults who may or may not have dependent children? Those are really the only categories in there. They do let married couples file separately if they sort of split everything, but that's really secondary. So basically you have 3 filing categories in the tax code. And then when you have a tax provision such as a standard deduction or a per person exemption or a child tax credit, it's simply put in as some sort of dollar figure and you multiply the number of applicable people by the dollar figure. So for example, if there is a personal exemption of X and you have 4 people in your household, then it's X times 4. That's pretty straightforward. People filing taxes do it all the time. This, however, is a very different design because you have to figure out the percent of poverty before you calculate people's tax liability or tax preference in this case. And the percent of poverty varies based on the number of people. So for example, the percent of poverty for a family of 3 would be the same regardless of whether the family consisted of 1 adult and 2 children or 2 adults and 1 child. Yet the family of 4 would have a different amount than the family of 3. Nowhere in the tax code is there any other provision that is linked to this kind of formula based on the federal poverty level. It is incredibly complicated to try to figure this out. This is why, for example, we saw that over half of the people who got tax credits for coverage through the exchange in 2014 wound up having to pay money back because it is extremely difficult to figure this out. Again, this became a reason for the drafters of this legislation to have a health insurance exchange because you had to have somebody do this for them. It wasn't just to screen for eligibility, it was also to figure out the right subsidy amount. Now, again, if you had done a different design where you simply said, well, we'll give X dollars per adult and Y dollars per kid, and you just do the math, and that's how much you get, and go take it to e-health insurance and buy insurance, that would have worked far, far better than this design. So we now also had another set of problems, and that's really where we get the third one, and that is the way that they changed the insurance rules. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the idea that people were excluded from coverage based on their previous medical history. The problem is that unless you understand the way the law was before the ACA or Obamacare, you don't understand how the relative magnitude of that problem. Before Obamacare, you had a market, and we still to a large extent have a market for private insurance that consists 90% of people who get coverage through an employer plan and 10% of people who buy it on their own directly, the so-called individual market. Back in 1996, this issue of people changing coverage and having prior medical conditions was very satisfactorily addressed for the 90% that got coverage through an employer. Basically, it said, look, if you go from one employer to another, or if you go to get a job, the employer offers a plan, they can't turn you down. If you otherwise are eligible to join that plan, they can't turn you down because you have a previous condition. Now, they are allowed to exclude that condition from coverage, but it was time limited. It could be no more than 12 months. Furthermore, they had to give you credit if you had done the right thing, as I like to say. If you had previously had coverage, whether it was another employer, an individual plan, even a government program, if you had previously had coverage just before you changed and wanted to get into this plan, say you changed jobs, they had to give you credit for that coverage. What that meant was, effectively, anybody who had been insured for at least 12 months could change to another employer plan, whether if they needed to or they wanted to, if they changed jobs, if their employer changed insurers. They could do that, and they were not going to be subjected to any higher rates than anybody else. They were not going to be excluded from coverage. They were not going to even have a particular condition or treatment that they had previously had excluded from coverage because they had done the right thing. They had bought and maintained coverage. And that system worked very well. As I said, it worked for 90% of the people who had private coverage in the employer market. It worked for 15 years. And this whole issue of pre-existing condition exclusions was not really an issue for that subset of the market. The problem was that back in 1996, Congress didn't apply the same reasonable and sensible rules to the individual market. So, as I have often said, even before Obamacare came along, the sensible thing would have been to extend those rules to the individual market. That way, the incentive would be to buy and keep coverage, and the protection that you would earn is that as long as you did that, you couldn't subsequently be denied or lose coverage just because you changed employers or changed insurers. Rather than doing that, however, what they did in this legislation was they banned the use of pre-existing condition exclusions entirely, and essentially created a dynamic whereby the reverse would happen. It would actually be in people's interest to wait until they were sick before getting medical care, as opposed to the previous set of incentives, which were to get health insurance before you needed it. Now, by saying, well, they'll have to take you anyway, regardless, no exceptions, they created a perverse incentive for people to avoid having health insurance until they actually needed to use it. That, of course, would have really wrecked the market. So, having created more of a problem, they then decided that the way to fix it was to mandate that everyone buy insurance. And that's where the individual mandate came from. So the point being is that if they had taken, and I think if anybody in redoing Obamacare or replacing it takes a more sensible approach on this issue, they would be able to provide people with the adequate and legitimate protections without having to resort to an individual mandate. So that was the third problem that we had. The fourth problem was, I think, particularly egregious, and that is that they then added rules on how the insurance should be rated, that is, the prices charged for the insurance, and particularly on age. Now, the thing to understand is that there is a natural variation in the use and consumption of medical care based on age, and that should be no surprise to anyone. By and large, younger adults, and I'm talking about the adult population, people between, say, the ages of 19 and 64, because after 65 there's a separate program, Medicare, for the adult population, for the elderly. But adults between 19 and 64, it's no surprise that there is a natural variation in the consumption of medical care by age. People who are, say, in their early 20s tend to be generally healthy, and they don't consume anywhere near as much medical care as the group of people who are, say, in their late 50s or early 60s. In fact, when actuaries plot this out, and they have done, and this is well known, the cost of the consumption of medical care for somebody who is, say, age 64 is about 5 times that for someone who is age 20. So you have what they refer to as a 5-to-1 ratio, meaning that for the same package of benefits, the cost and therefore the premium would need to be, say, $500 for somebody who's 64, and for the exact same thing, $100 for somebody who is age 20. Now, this is important for another reason, and that is that as a rule, people tend to earn more as they get older, which is also not very surprising. So between being relatively healthy and having relatively lower incomes, young adults, if the cost of coverage is too high, are the people who are most likely to say, I'll spend my money on something else, I won't get insurance. And indeed, we have decades of data that show that among adults, the uninsured are disproportionately younger adults. By that I mean people between the ages of 19 and 30 or 35. And so that is the population that, if you are concerned about insuring uninsured people, you would want to target. What the ACA did is they said, well, insurers can only charge a variance of 3-to-1 based on age, not the more normal 5-to-1. That had the effect of bringing down the cost of coverage artificially for people who are, say, 50 to 64-year-olds, and dramatically raising it again artificially for people who are 20 to 30 or 35. In fact, you brought down the cost, or you artificially reduced the premiums for people in their 50s by about 10 or 12%, but the effect of the law has been to artificially increase the premiums for young adults by 30 to 40%. This makes absolutely no sense, given that the people who are most likely to be uninsured, who are most sensitive to the price of insurance, are younger adults. And so we've seen that in the rollout of the legislation. Even in spite of the fact that it's heavily subsidized, they're not getting the take-up among that population that they expected. The better approach, obviously, would have been to leave normal variations in age rating and simply maybe age adjust a standard contribution amount so that somebody who was older might get a bit more. Finally, the other thing that this legislation did was to add some very costly benefit mandates onto the coverage, and this affects everybody regardless of their age. This is, I think, the source of a lot of opposition to the legislation, because at the starting point, the United States already had the world's most expensive health system, and now the federal government comes along and mandates additional benefits that make it even more expensive. So that, too, worked against the objective that the authors of the legislation had of providing more people with coverage. Because if you increase the cost through benefit mandates across the board and make the whole thing more expensive, it's like pushing a rock up a hill. You've just made it more likely that people are going to look at avoiding coverage. So those are some of the key flaws that I think we have in the legislation, and those are the areas where I think a more sensible replacement approach could could come out with a much better solution. There are many other provisions in here that are also questionable, and some of them are downright counterproductive. But these are the key ones. I think if you were to fix the way that the assistance is provided, to make it more uniform and standard, to make it function so that you didn't have to rely on some complicated system of eligibility and enrollment, that would be a big step. The other is to have more appropriate rules, as we did before, so that people had the right incentives to buy and keep coverage, so that you didn't need to mandate that employers provide coverage, and you didn't need to mandate and penalize people for not buying coverage. And then finally, to, rather than try to standardize all of the health insurance, and particularly to flatten the rates at the expense of raising costs even further on young adults, if instead you simply allowed insurers to provide appropriate market prices and to vary the design to serve different customer segments. Not everyone wants the same type of insurance. Some people might prefer a higher deductible and pay for more on their own. Others might prefer a more comprehensive plan and pay less out of pocket. That's fine. I don't have a problem with either of those. It's just like any other market where different consumers have different preferences. The government's role should be very limited in making sure that the insurers are solvent, that they can make good on the promises that they have made, and that is something that states have done for years. There was no need for the federal government to do that. But then step back and let the insurers and the providers innovate and compete on offering people a better value approach. So there's no need, in my view, to standardize the coverage, and in fact, it actually works against innovation in this area because it prevents somebody from saying, hey, there's a better way to do it. How about you pay for this and we'll pay for that, and slicing the package a different way that might be attractive to some people. So those are the key issues that I see in this. These are the things that I think will be dealt with in the coming months or years, really, in terms of places where we would look to repeal and replace various provisions of the law. Thank you again for having me, and hope that you found this helpful.
The next speaker is Chris Koopman from the Mercado Center.
Hey guys, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak with you this evening to talk to you about a topic that I spend a lot of time researching and writing about, and that is the sharing economy. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about some of the stories with the sharing economy, in particular firms like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, and all the sorts of new innovative apps and services that are helping connect people with one another and allowing them to take things that they have and put it to work for themselves. But I want to start with a story. So imagine you are in a foreign country, let's say Paris, France, and you've been out on the town for an evening, and you are trying to find a way home. Now, not today, let's say 2008, 2007. You're trying to find a way home. You're unfamiliar with the area. Let's say you've had a couple of drinks. What do you do? Well, typically people would find a cab. Now, for some people, that's more difficult than others. In particular, if you don't know the language, you're unfamiliar with the area, and you're just a little nervous about being in a place like that. It can be daunting. And that was actually a situation many people will find themselves in, and in particular, the founders of Uber found themselves in. What they found was they weren't able to get a cab when they wanted. So what did they do? They found a better way. They put their entrepreneurial hats on, and they came up with a simple idea, an app that connected people who had cars with people who wanted cars. And this has really been the archetypal story of the sharing economy. Is it's been entrepreneurs finding new solutions to old problems, in particular getting things to people who want them when they want them. So in a story with Uber, it's connecting people who want a ride with people who have cars. Now, people have looked at this across all sorts of sectors. It's now in finance, it's in housing, it's in office space, it's in food, it's now in really the most popular area is in transportation. But as these firms have continued to grow over time, they've been running into a series of issues, in particular regulatory issues. More often than not, as they've grown and provided these services to people, they've run into regulators who say, you can't do that. Why? Because they're new, they're different, and the regulators never expected them to arrive in the form that they did. That is, a taxi regulator, for example, never envisioned a world where people would be connected with one another to drive each other around in their personal cars. So you have regulators who are scared, regulators who are nervous, and you have incumbent firms, in particular, those taxi companies who are benefiting from the regulation and the stifled competition, now looking and saying, we've invested a whole lot of time and effort into this world, and we don't want to see that go by the wayside now that the world has innovated past us. But there are some things I really want to talk about with this issue that I think gets overlooked with a lot of the debates in the sharing economy. In particular, for college students, a lot of the fear of the sharing economy is something of a generational gap. So what you see is you see people who aren't as comfortable with a world where people are connecting in these new innovative ways. And they're afraid to let that world grow. They're afraid to let that world create the type of opportunity that it's currently creating. So what do you see? A recent study of the sharing economy found this. Almost 40% of those people who were surveyed as producers in the sharing economy were between the ages of 18 and 24 years old. And that is actually also the group with the highest unemployment rate currently in the U.S. economy. So what you're finding is people are using these services to have opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have. There are people who, let's say, are college graduates using time in between their classes or in between semesters to take what they've got, be it their free time or their car or maybe some skills they've picked up along the way, and put it to work for themselves. But not only that, they're able to take the idea of the summer job and turn it into a 12-month gig that you can now have opportunity when you want it. It's the on-demand economy, and people usually talk about that with regard to the workers, but it's also work on demand. You can log into the app, you can log out of the app, and you can come back and forth and go from app to app as you want. And so what you're seeing is a lot of people, in particular the people who are benefiting most from this, are not the people, that is college students and recent college graduates, aren't typically the people who are in the position of regulating and in a position of influencing regulators. So you're seeing a sort of a generational gap, if you will, between the sharing economy and the people who are in a position to regulate the sharing economy. But another thing that is really missed in this conversation, and the other point I really want to make today, is that the sharing economy makes everyone better. And I'll keep this in the context of ride sharing, but the sharing economy makes the riders better, it makes the drivers better, it makes the platforms better, or the incumbent companies better, and it also makes government better. Competition is making everyone better on all of these margins. And I'll go through each of these, riders, drivers, platforms, and government. I'll go through each of these in turn. But with regard to riders, I'm sure you all know this, and anyone who's been in an Uber knows it, is that at the end of the ride, you get to rate your driver. That is, you get on your smartphone, It tells you how long you've driven, how much you're being charged, and then gives you the option between 1 and 5 stars. And you have an opportunity to say 5 stars if the ride was perfect, 1 star if something went horrendously wrong with the drive. But you're given an opportunity to give feedback to the platform and ultimately give feedback to the driver about how well he or she did. But many people don't know this, is that the riders are also being rated as well. So as a rider, you have a strong incentive to be the best version of yourself that you can to ensure you get a good rating. In particular, because pickups in Uber and Lyft and a lot of these other apps as well, the people who are producing in the platforms have an opportunity to select who they work with based on your accumulative rating, that is how well you've been as a rider in the past. But it also makes drivers better too. Again, not just the 5-star rating system makes drivers better, but the competition between Uber and Lyft and the competition between Uber, Lyft, and taxis makes everyone better. So a recent study with regard to the number of taxi complaints in Chicago and New York found that once the sharing economy apps entered the market, the number of complaints were already declining, but what you see is once the apps enter the market, the decline becomes even more sharp. What's the story there? Is that taxi drivers realize that to survive and compete with Uber, they had to provide a better service. So it's making drivers for both taxis and the ride-sharing companies better. And then you see things within the sharing economy apps that are driving the drivers to be better versions of themselves as well. Lyft, for example, gives out awards for quirkiness and outgoing behavior and all this sort of activity to incentivize their drivers to be better. So we have riders being better, we have drivers being better. We also have the platforms being driven to be the best version of themselves that they can. So a lot of the public policy debates around the sharing economy have gone from should the sharing economy exist to more of the second-order policy issues with regard to employment issues. So are sharing economy producers, employees, or contractors of the platform? Now, a lot of people say the employment relationship is necessary to protect producers, but I would submit that there is already a strong incentive for the platforms to provide the best environment for the producers to work already. And why do I say this? In particular, because the value of these networks, Uber and Lyft are valued in the tens of billions of dollars. The value of these networks are in the ability for someone like you and me to simply get on our phone and have a ride available to us nearly instantaneously. I mean, the rides are within a matter of minutes, a car comes and picks us up. But that's only available to us so long as there are drivers within the app willing to drive within the platforms themselves. So Uber has a strong incentive not only to keep us as riders in the app, and that's why they give out all these free rides and credits and this type of thing, but they also have a strong incentive to provide the best environment for their drivers to ensure that their drivers stay in the app. That is, as easy as it is for me to switch from app A to B, it's as easy as that for Uber to go from having all the drivers to Lyft having all the drivers. So they have fierce competition between themselves for drivers and producers, and it's driving them to provide the best environment for their drivers. They have a strong incentive to protect and support and encourage their drivers to continue to drive in the platform. But also, it drives government to be better as well. A lot of times what people are talking about when they talk about the sharing economy is sort of the competition between incumbent firms and the new innovative firms. But it isn't just that. It's that the new innovative firms are providing, in some way, an alternative to the old regulated solution. So let me give you an example of this. For as long as tourists have been flying into Las Vegas to go to the Las Vegas Strip, taxi drivers have been trying to take people the long way. That is, to try to increase the amount of money they get per ride. Instead of going the straight way from the airport to the Las Vegas Strip, they take the long way from from the airport to the Las Vegas Strip. So this has caused a lot of problems both for passengers, but for government. They've had a very, very difficult time trying to solve this problem. They've tried all sorts of things over the past 5-6 decades, including giant signs in the airport, giant signs on the road, undercover sting operations, public awareness campaigns, a PDF form to fill out in case you think you've been long-hauled, is what they call it, taking the long way. PDF forms for you to fill out and submit to the taxi commission that will then investigate whether or not you've been taken the wrong way, and then they will try to find a solution from there. Now, the sharing economy shows up in Las Vegas and solves this problem in a matter of weeks. You know, as long as it takes for Uber and Lyft and the ride-sharing companies to really get a foothold in the market, that's how long it took them to solve this problem. Again, like I said before, the 5-star rating system gives passengers the instant ability to seek redress when they think they've been taken the wrong way. Now, you add into this all of the additional innovations with Google Maps, the GPS function in the apps themselves, the Uber and Lyft apps, and the fact that they have, you know, a really sophisticated way of telling whether or not a driver has deviated from the route, including showing you the way you should have gone and the way you've been taken. It gives riders an ability to have recourse that hasn't been available to them in the traditional regulated solutions. So now the pressure has been turned up on the regulators, who have to justify their existence in some form or fashion to find new, innovative, more efficient, and more consumer-friendly solutions to these old traditional problems. So you're seeing the sharing economy driving everyone, riders, drivers, the platforms, and the regulators, the government themselves, to all be better versions of what they have been and what they could be. And you have this competition driving all of this. But again, like I said, as the sharing economy has grown, they've run into these regulatory problems along the way. That is, government unwilling to adapt and change, incumbents unwilling to adapt and change, and leaving people in a position where tourists in Vegas for some months were left without Uber and Lyft because the government said, you can't have this service because we haven't deemed it safe for you. Although you believe and you think and you know that it's the better option for you, we don't want you to have this service for the time being. So the real question for people in positions of policy making and people who are thinking about these things into the future is, are we as a society willing to adapt, change, and evolve with technological innovations and changes in the market over time, or are we going to continue to insist on applying old world and outmoded forms of regulation onto these new innovative devices, services, apps, and this entire industry of firms? Now, again, the sharing economy is radically changing our world for the better. It's changing the way that we shop, the way we borrow, the way we save, the way we get to work, the way we work, and everything in between. And the only thing standing in the way of that really is those people who are unwilling to adapt and change, and those people who are unwilling to accept that innovation is here for good. These technological innovations are going to continue to drive us into a better state. And it's only when we accept that we recognize all of the beauty and all of the amazing things that the sharing economy and technological innovation in general has to offer. So again, thank you guys for allowing me to talk about this. Hopefully this opens some eyes to some new questions, some new ideas, and perhaps drives you guys to think about these things in a new and different way. And hopefully, if I can be a resource to any of you, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to discuss these issues or talk these issues or whatever with you guys into the future. So thanks again for letting me talk about this with you, and have a good evening.
Up next, I would like to introduce Mr. Mark Hall of George Fox University.
Hi, I'm Mark David Hall from George Fox University, and I was asked to give a short talk on religious liberty for Freedom Week. So in the traditional telling of the tale, America was founded by Puritans seeking religious liberty. But this was true only in the sense that the Puritans sought the freedom to worship God as they thought best. Generally, they did not attempt to compel belief, and they even tolerated orderly dissenters. However, disorderly dissenters, such as Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, were exiled, and upon rare occasions, very disorderly dissenters, such as the Quaker Mary Dyer, were even executed. But fortunately, there's more to America than New England. The mid-Atlantic colonies, notably the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania, was notably more generous with respect to the treatment of religious dissenters. The southern colonies are often described as commercial ventures, but the Anglican Church was the established church in each of them, and religious dissenters were actually often treated quite poorly. Now, fortunately, the lot of religious minorities in America began to improve significantly in the 17th century. These advances were aided by Parliament's Act of Toleration, pragmatic attempts to deal with religious diversity, and biblical and theoretical arguments for the liberty of conscience made by men such as John Locke, Roger Williams, William Penn, and others. In the roughly 160 years from the earliest settlements to the American founding, the colonies became more accepting of dissenters and of dissenting practices. Now, America's separation from Great Britain raised a number of questions with respect to religious liberty. The controversies in every state are worthy of consideration, but those in Virginia are perhaps most interesting and most illustrative. In 1776, the Virginia Convention created a committee to write a Bill of Rights. This task largely fell to George Mason, who drafted what became Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It reads, and I quote, that as religion or the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration and exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Now, this draft was enormously influential. It was circulated throughout America and was adopted in other state constitutions. But in Virginia, it was not this draft which became law. Because in the Virginia Convention, James Madison, in his first public act, he stood up and he objected to this language of toleration. He insisted that religious liberty is a right, a natural right. It's not simply a gift of the state, and so therefore it must be always protected. The Virginia Convention agreed with James Madison, and Mason's proposal was amended to make it crystal clear that religious liberty, again, is a natural right. Now, unlike most state constitutions, the federal Constitution of 1787 did not contain a provision to protect religious liberty. But this was because, and this is a very important point, the original supporters of the Constitution simply thought the federal government had no power to interfere with religious belief or practice. But nonetheless, the Anti-Federalists led a great outcry, and eventually this resulted, of course, in the Bill of Rights, which includes the First Amendment. The relevant provision from our perspective reads, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, America's founders differed on a wide range of issues, but there was almost universal commitment that religious liberty must be well protected. This commitment is summarized well by President George Washington in a 1790 letter to the Hebrew Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, it's very important to know by way of context that when he wrote this letter, something like 99.9% of Americans would have identified themselves as Christians of one stripe or another. There are precious few Jews in North America, and nonetheless, this is a letter that President Washington wrote to this synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. In it, he states, the citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it were an indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that those who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it to on all occasion their effectual support. So over the last 230 years, America's commitment to religious liberty has actually improved. Let me just give one pretty recent example. In 1993, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was intended to and has been used to better protect the religious liberty of all Americans. Now, one thing I want to note, really to emphasize, is that this bill passed in the House without a dissenting vote. It passed in the Senate by a vote of 97-3, and it was signed into law by President Bill Clinton, a Democrat. If you pay attention to the media today, you might think that religious liberty is a Republican issue. This is simply not true. Historically and at their best, all Americans, anti-federalists and federalists, judicial activists and judicial conservatives, Republican and Democrats, have made it a top priority to protect what the American founders called the sacred rights of conscience. I would urge you all to do the same. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Next, I'd like to introduce Northwood University's own Tim Nash to speak about the Industrial Revolution.
So you're almost done, huh? How many of you have been here for all the presentations? That's pretty good. Pretty good. How many of you are interested in doing some writing for some of our publications? Or maybe helping out for a few shekels or money on a few of our research projects this year? So if you are, why don't you stop up afterward, and we'll talk about some of those opportunities. I'm sure President Pretty may have mentioned, publications like In Defense of Capitalism. We're also going to be announcing very soon the establishment of a major free enterprise think tank here at the university, and so if these ideas resonate with you, there could be some really good opportunities. I'm always looking for some, we don't rule out seniors, but looking for some really bright freshmen that we can work with for 4 years. But if you're a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and you're interested, again, please make sure you come on up afterward or stop by my office in the Sloan building. I would first and foremost like to thank all of you, and especially Professor Takarov, for putting together Freedom Week. It's a monumental undertaking, and it is something that is not just wonderful in terms of substance. I've been able to be a part of a little of it this week, but it is truly something that speaks to where we are as a society, where we are as a country, and quite frankly, it speaks to, I think, a real tipping point in the world today. And the tipping point in the world today really has you take a real strong look at where will this country be in 10 or 15 years, 20 years? Where will the world economy be? And what's really quite interesting is if you look at, say, China, and you think about China 30, 40 years ago. I've been going to China on and off since the late 1980s. And when I think about what existed in China in the late 1980s, it was probably, for most Chinese people, it was backward by any standards of the world. I remember being in a car in Beijing on one of the main highways, and these are 4 lanes, ladies and gentlemen, in each direction, and there were 1 or 2 cars. You could drive for miles and not see a car. and then you'd get off the freeway onto the regular streets, and there were millions, literally millions of bikes in Beijing. And you fought the city traffic with a car because the bikes rode on the main thoroughfares. It'd be like having hundreds and thousands of bikes on Saginaw Road here in Midland with one or two cars. And now you rarely see a bicycle in China, and you see literally millions of automobiles. China is now the world's #1 producer of new vehicles. It's the second largest automobile market in the world behind the United States in terms of total automobiles. And so when you think about it, in many ways, the overarching theme with China is that they are becoming a freer, more competitive economy. And as you look at it, you say, well, what does this have to do with the British Industrial Revolution? What does this have to do with, wrapping up Freedom Week? And I think what's important to understand is that freedom and the ability to allow entrepreneurs to do whatever she or he chooses to do is the incredible ingredient, or is literally the wellspring of human progress. And if you go back and you look at China, literally, so you think about it, since the mid to late 1980s, since Deng Xiaoping bringing about increased freedom, look what the Chinese people have accomplished in under 40 years. China is a dramatically different and a much more powerful and a much more productive economy because of the introduction of greater individual freedom, greater property rights, greater risk-taking by foreign and domestic entrepreneurs. So if you go back and think about the British Industrial Revolution, and we forget about how these things have come about, how these experiments with freedom have taught us wonderful things. If you go back and look at the British Industrial Revolution, did an econometric analysis of the British Industrial Revolution for my master's thesis in economics. And one of the things that was really unique about the British Industrial Revolution was it really took place after the first major introduction of freedom. And roughly 100 years earlier, in the mid to late 1600s, you had pockets of freedom on a local level than on a national level. But when we talk about slavery in the United States, slavery existed all across Europe. If you think of the British term, or the English term, I should say, serf. A serf was an indentured servant, or a serf. And it wasn't until the mid to late 1600s that slavery or serfdom was eliminated in most of the countries of Europe. And the Brits were the leaders in reducing and eliminating indentured servitude. But the point that's important to think about is, for literally a millennium, more than a millennium, more than 1,000 years, the vast majority of your relatives, if you're from Europe, were slaves. Over 90% of the population, from the fall of Rome till the Renaissance, the vast majority of people were slaves. But then you introduce freedom. You say to people, you're free. But the problem, think about it, go back 300 years. There were hardly any roads. The automobile hadn't been invented. You were an incredibly wealthy human being if you could afford an ox or a horse or a cart. So the point is, even if you were freed, where were you going to get a job? So in essence, after freedom, you could go anywhere you want, but where were you going to go? And so the fact of the matter is, if you don't think about it this way, kind of pause and think about it. If you go back to 1800 in the United States, 1800 in the United States, over 80, some economists say as much as 90% of U.S. GDP was either domestic in the home or farming. And if you go back to the British Industrial Revolution, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, the beginning of it, Think about what choices people had. You just ended indentured servitude, and what were your choices? You're free, but the vast majority of the jobs are in agriculture. Who controls agriculture? The landed gentry, the House of Lords in Parliament. They're the lawmakers, they're the rule makers. So they own these big estates. Yorkshire, Devonshire, these big counties in England were named after the York family, the Devon family. And so you have freedom, but you had a real problem because you didn't have many choices. You could work on a farm, or you could work on a farm, or you could work on a farm. And if you got the backbone and you said, I'm not going to work on this farm, and I'm going to walk down these terrible roads, not well paved, and I'm going to go to the next farm, well, probably the next farm is a Devon farm or a York farm. And they're going to ask you, where did you work last? And you say, I work for that mean Mr. York. And then they're going to say, oh, you worked for my uncle. And so they might offer you a job at an even lower wage rate. But it was the Industrial Revolution, it was the factory system, ladies and gentlemen, that provided competition. For the first time on a major level, when the factories sprung up, factories offered the first competition for labor. You know, they weren't competing against each other. They were the early innovators, these great entrepreneurs that created the early steel mills or iron works or knitting mills or different types of clothing factories, etc. They didn't have any competition with themselves, but they were creating competition for laborers. So it's a pretty backward economy 300 years ago. So you could work on a farm, or you could work on a farm, or you could work on a farm, but now you have a choice. And so how do you get the people off the farm and into the factories? You had to pay them a higher wage. So you create wage competition. And if the landed gentry, the farm owner, the lord or the lady, wanted to keep you, they had to pay your higher wages. And of course, they didn't like it. They didn't like competition. They didn't like the fact that this freedom is causing these entrepreneurs to take risks and to create these new opportunities. But what's important to understand is that when you analyze all of the factors, if I asked you the question, it's 1700 and it's London, England, the most advanced city in the world by most people's estimates. 1700, London, England, what percent of children died before the age of 5 in London? What would you guess? Maybe you want to take a guess? 37%. Good guess, but way, way low. Double it and add 1. Very good. You're all part of our physics department here at Northwood. 75% of all children died before the age in 1700. And the fact of the matter is, again, the cities that existed, the shops that existed, that was the exception between the employment on the farms. The vast majority of people were employed in the farms, and the cities were very small when you go back to the 1600s. And so the fact of the matter is that if you looked at average life expectancy for a female, it's probably about 24 years of age. For a male, it was about 26. For a female, what was the number one cause of death before the British Industrial Revolution? Childbirth, absolutely. And so when you think about what the factory system brought about, the first point is it brought about competition for labor. You had a choice. People were now bidding for your services. And so the more complex the economy, obviously the better it is for the worker. because the worker has more choices. The worker has more options and opportunities. And so when you think about the first factories were not very popular. The Parliament's controlled by the House of Lords, the major decision-making part of the economy, is controlled by the landed gentry, the lords and the ladies, thus the House of Lords. The people that owned these large lands, these large estates, automatically had positions in the British Parliament. And they would pass the title and they would pass the power down to their eldest son. And if it wasn't the eldest son, it would be the son-in-law of the eldest daughter of that family. And if they did not have children, it would be a cousin or a niece or a nephew that would get that authority. So you had this political system that allowed the landed gentry to protect themselves. So when these factories started to emerge, on the one hand, the factories were producing piping, so they would mass produce piping so that you could irrigate your farm fields. So people say, well, that's not a bad thing, that farm or that factory. I can now irrigate my entire farm and do it for a much lower cost. I don't have these open trenches where the sun beats down and evaporates half the water. I can put underground piping in and do things a lot more effectively, a lot more efficiently. We went from mass production of iron in the factories to the production of steel. All of these things happened after the late 1600s. Into the early 1700s is when historians tell us the British Industrial Revolution began. But the point is, the word revolution is wrong because it really was the British Industrial Evolution. It didn't happen like that overnight like a revolution does. It was really evolutionary rather than revolutionary. But the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you look at these factories beginning to emerge, the landed gentry, most of them looked at them as a threat because most of them lost their best employees, their hardest workers, to the factories. And if you look at maybe in your high school history classes, or maybe if you went to school elsewhere and then transferred, you were taught that the factories were terrible. The British Industrial Revolution was a terrible thing. It was a god-awful thing. People worked in dark, dirty, dingy factories with little ventilation and little lighting. And see, this was part of the whole plan of the greedy capitalists to take advantage of the employees. And it's partially true, but for the most part, it's false. And the reason why I word it that way is that the factories, these opportunities that gave people that didn't come from means, they gave the average person a chance to have a higher income, a better life than they would have had on the farm. And so you look at what the landed gentry did. What did the lords and ladies do? They used their political power to thwart their competition. And so if you ask yourself the question, were the factories dark and dirty and dingy? Many of them were. Did they not have light in the factory? Many of them didn't. Did they not have good ventilation? Many of them didn't. But it wasn't in most cases because these were greedy, evil business people. It's because of the following. How do you think they taxed factories during the early days of the British Industrial Revolution? I'm sorry? By production? Yeah, that's a logical way. See, you're too smart, you're too logical, and you're too good and decent. So if we don't do it by production, which they didn't, what might be another way? By profits? Another good idea, but no, that's not how they did it. What are some of the ways we tax factories today? Helps all of you go to high school if you went to a public high school. No. That wouldn't help you go to school, but that could be profits, wages, yeah. What's a big source of revenue for K through 12 public education in Michigan? starts with a P, then there's an R, and an O. Vanna, you gonna ask for a vowel? I'm trying to be funny. Very good. Jeopardy. Or not Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune. Thank you. But you're right. So property taxes. Good thought. But that's wrong too. So they didn't tax production. They didn't tax income. They didn't tax profits. They didn't tax property. How did they tax the early factories in Great Britain? Another interesting idea, but nope, that's not how they did it. I'm sorry? They absolutely did. I'm sorry? Nope.
They just gave them a number that they wanted to be.
Nope. Not lights. Because remember, Edison hadn't invented the light bulb yet. But it was the number of windows. So they said there are two factors with windows. One, there was a tax for the number of windows you had in the factory, and what do you think was if they were windows of equal size, why might you have a higher tax on one of the windows? No, that's a good idea. I've never read that, but that would be interesting if you were a sinister politician. But what is another way? Think along those lines. It was the elevation of the window. So the higher the window, the more you could bring light into or illuminate a larger portion of the factory. So if it was a 2 or 3 story factory like this room, you instead of having the window down here, if you had the window up here or even on the roof, you could illuminate more of the factory. And you could make working conditions a lot better. You could reduce the need to burn candles or to burn oil for lighting in the factory. So if you had natural lighting, you could cut your costs. You could cut the candle fumes, the oil lamp fumes inside the factory. And you also had a breeze going through, because what was one of the real benefits over time of the factory system? What are some of the things that they didn't have before the British Revolution, Industrial Revolution, that they had after, during and after? Okay, and what did they produce? Don't say automobiles, because that would have been too early. But what do you think they mass produced? Well, they a little bit later. You know, that was really after the British Industrial Revolution, but, you know. Shoes. Okay. So people had shoes, absolutely. What else? Clothing, yeah. Mass production of clothing. Later, but yeah, that stuff started to be mass produced. But think about more simple, basic things. Do you know, if you go back to, any of you ever go to France, to the palace at Versailles? If you haven't, someday, if you get a chance to go to our term and year program your senior year, you should go, or go on your own and go to the palace at Versailles. It's this incredible palace outside of downtown Paris. And the interesting part of it is that they used to talk about how the Louvre, which is one of the world's great museums, that used to be the palace that the King and Queen of France lived in, and that thing's huge. Think about it. One of the largest museums in the world, and you had a single family living there. Then they built an even larger monstrosity outside of town called the Palace at Versailles. But the thing that was unique about it was that the King and Queen in the summer would not let the peasantry come and voice their opinions or their need for change or their requests from the king or queen. And when they allowed them, even in the spring, fall, or winter, they had to stay roughly from me to you in distance. What do you think the reason was for that? And why would they let the average commoner come into the palace during the summer? The smell. The stench. Do you realize that T.S. Ashton, the great British economic historian, said before the British Industrial Revolution, the average Brit took 3 showers or baths, probably didn't have much in the area of showers, but 3 baths in their lifetime. Think about it. Once when they were born, once when they were married, and once before, as part of the ceremony when they died. Now, I'd have gone on record and saying, look, if I only have 3, bury me stinky. But think about that. The average person took 3 baths in their lifetime before the British Industrial Revolution. Go back and look at some of this if you're a fan of economics. The average price of a bar of soap before the British Industrial Revolution, what do you think it was?
17 cents.
Let's look at it. I didn't word that well. What do you think it was in terms of an average week's wage?
3 weeks.
A month. A month's wage for a bar of soap. A towel. A good towel was 2 to 3 months' wages. Perfume, which was the deodorant of the day, was 3 to 4 months for 2 ounces. And all of these things became mass-produced during the British Industrial Revolution. And what do you think happened to the price? Price dropped dramatically. And the common person could afford soap. The common person could afford perfume. Shampoo was mass-produced. Those were things that were luxuries of the incredibly wealthy prior to the British Industrial Revolution. And so if you look at the greatness of the British Industrial Revolution, not only were these entrepreneurs incredible people, incredible women and men that thought of all of these inventions and innovations, but they also had the courage to fight the government for the proper form of government that didn't protect business and didn't protect labor, but protected consumers. They wanted to create the environment where you had the best possible product at the most competitive price. And so as you think about it, and then you look at China today, look at what's happened in China. And again, in less than 40 years, you've seen China go from an impoverished country to being the second largest economy in the world. And unless something dramatic happens, within the next 20 years will be the largest economy in the world because of the introduction of freedom. But what I would say is China's at a crossroads because China is going through its own industrial revolution. It's more of a technological revolution, but there's obviously industry in China to that regard. But China's real difficulty is, more than half the businesses are partially or completely owned by the government. And, right now, if you look at their automobile companies, they have 133 producers of automobiles, light trucks, and SUVs. 2/3 of them are completely owned by regional governments, and less than a quarter consistently make a profit. That can't happen. That can't continue within the Chinese economy. Same thing was true in the United States in 1910, 1915, but the point is, what happened is that we went from 133 automobile companies to really 2 to 3, depending on how you look at Chrysler, that are American-based today. Companies like Pierce, companies like Arrow, companies like Studebaker, companies like Nash. These are all major automobile producers that either got bought out or went out of business. China's going to have to continue to evolve to a free economy and let that logical extension of its own British Industrial Revolution move forward. But I think the last thought that I would leave you with is the lessons of the British Industrial Revolution are with us all the time today. When you think about the fact that you're all too young to have lived in the mid-1980s. But go rent the movie Wall Street, okay? Rent the movie Wall Street, and when you get to the scene where Gordon Gekko, Michael Douglas is the wealthy financier who's not the kind of guy you'd like to date your daughter, and he's walking down the beach, and he has one of the early cell phones with him. This is about 1985, 1986 is when the movie came out. And he's walking down the beach, and he's got something that looks like a brick with buttons on it. And ladies and gentlemen, that was one of the early handheld cell phones. When I was your age, I remember I was running through Central Park with a buddy of mine, and we were going up to an economics conference north of New York City. And we stopped because one of the first cell phones, that would have been 1978 or 79 when we did this, that cell phone was really something that you would have seen George Patton use in World War II. Here's a limousine out on the street. This guy's sitting on a park bench, and he's got this box that looked like a small briefcase, and then there's a phone that comes out of it, and he makes a phone call. He's on the phone. And we finished running, came back, and he's getting off the phone, and I thought, what the heck, unless he could tell me to shut up. I said, sir, I don't mean to be rude, but is that a phone? And he said, yeah. He said, it's called a cellular phone. And I said, why are you sitting here in Central Park? He said, because the reception down the main streets in New York is not good with all the skyscrapers. And he said, I had a call to Paris, and I was looking for some privacy. And, so I was surprised that he answered the question. I said, how much does that cell phone cost? He said, $40,000. I said, what's your monthly bill? Now remember, this is like 1978 or 1979. What do you think his monthly bill for service was? $12,000 a month. And all he had was this really not so convenient system, and all he could do, he had no apps, had no email, had no texting. And the interesting part of it was that when he was out in the country driving back to his home in Connecticut, he got great reception. And so he was a very important executive, obviously. I never found out who he was. He didn't give us that kind of information. But he could make calls all the way to work and all the way home. And this call that he had to take, he went out to Central Park because it was, the right kind of reception from the satellite. So that was 78, 79. Go to 1985, 86, Gordon Gekko. He's now walking down the beach. He doesn't have to have a big suitcase. He doesn't have to have a cord going from it, but it looks like a brick with buttons. And it is strictly a cell phone. That's all it does. He makes calls. He can send out, make a call, receive a call. He's walking on the beach because the reception in his house on the beach isn't good. So he's walking down the beach making a phone call. That phone cost that year for that model of cell phone in the real world was $12,500 in 1986. And the monthly service, base service was $2,000, and then you got X amount of charge if you went over your minutes. And then think about it today. You can get a great cell phone for how much? Any of you bought a cell phone recently? What'd you pay for your cell phone? Anybody want to admit? You paid $500 for your cell phone? No, I'm just saying, just the phone. Okay, $35 for the phone, and what's your monthly service? $40 a month. So you have a phone that is hundreds of times better than either of the examples I gave you, and 1/10 the cost. And then if you adjusted it for inflation, because today's dollar doesn't buy as much as the dollar in 86 or the dollar in 78, 79, you're paying almost nothing. But the point is that those early entrepreneurs that saw things that most people didn't see, they created these products, and it was the rich that bought them. But just think, if rich people didn't exist, and there wasn't a rich guy to buy that cell phone in that limo that I saw in 1978, there never would have been 20 years later or 10 years later, what am I talking about, somebody walking down the beach with a better phone for 1/10 the cost to buy and dramatically lower monthly bills. And so you never would have had the cell phone in the briefcase, which really stemmed from World War II, the old cell phones that they used during the tank battles. They made them commercially viable. Rich people bought them. Enough rich people bought them that they made them better, smaller, more efficient. And now today, President Obama is giving out cell phones to everybody, so there's not a person that doesn't have a cell phone today. And the cost of a cell phone is dramatically lower because of competition. You know, most households have more automobiles than they have people. That's an example. Most people have, most individuals have a cell phone. My wife and I have 6 grandchildren, and we have one who just celebrated her 5th birthday. And she said to me at her birthday party, she said, "Grandpa, when are you going to get me a cell phone?" And she knows more about a cell phone than I do. But my point with it is that it's that freedom, ladies and gentlemen. It's that competition. And so much of it really stemmed from events in history like the British Industrial Revolution. And the fact of the matter is that when you have freedom, you have competition, and you have people that have the money that are willing to take a risk on a technology, look what the rest of us enjoy because those early entrepreneurs took a risk and they brought products to the market. You wouldn't have had the British Industrial Revolution if some wealthy people didn't decide to build factories. You wouldn't have the cell phones that you have today had it not been for wealthy people not only taking the existing technology and producing the products, but then making them better and less expensive, and eventually saying, geez, the masses of people, if we can get it down low enough, will afford to buy them. And then you think about all the apps that you have. Gordon Gekko couldn't, in Wall Street, he couldn't text, he couldn't send emails. He didn't have anywhere the apps. He couldn't have called an Uber from his cell phone, a cab to get back home. So my point with it is, congratulations to all of you for being here. Congratulations to all of you for being part of Freedom Week. Especially congratulations to Alex and his team for putting this together. And let's just not only celebrate all the freedoms that we enjoy living in a blessed country that has tremendous amounts of freedom, but let's understand that it's up to us to protect those freedoms and to continue to make the world a better place. Have a great weekend, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.